Welcome back to part two. Um, so next we're going to talk about the issues affecting the WTO today. So when we left, we were discussing the WTO, which came out of the GATT. We talked about the most favored nation status. We talked about how the WTO operates to mediate disputes and set the rules for global trade. Um, and how they continue to add to the already 30,000 pages of agreements which already exist. Um, so we can acknowledge that during the period of global trade, there has been a lowering of world poverty, specifically those who live in extreme poverty, leading many to underscore that the relationship between free trade and a general improvement in the standard of living for many around the world, um, that they coincide, right? Um, Nonetheless, uh, this is not always the case. And due to this, many criticisms of global trade and globalization have increased in recent years. One main criticism is that the trading rules have not been designed to benefit poor nation states and their institutions, as well as their citizens, but rather are designed to benefit multinational corporations, often located within the West. Many have argued that such rules are not also designed to benefit rich countries, even their entire state societal complex, and the vast majority of their citizens, but rather the multinational corporations and elites which are situated within these countries and operate transnationally or globally. This means a majority of the individuals which are not attached to the leadership of multinational corporations. I'm sure myself and many of you are the same. We do not benefit from that. They have argued that we do not benefit from the trade rules as much as, for example, Nike or Apple or Microsoft or McDonald's, etc. Right? Um, and this is especially true for poor countries, which are sometimes less powerful than the multinational corporations that exploit these countries. So we've discussed in previous weeks how certain multinational corporations have even eclipsed their resources eclipse that of many nations around the world. So we can see here there's a power dynamic that's quite interesting emerging. Um, Rich countries and their corporations are able to set up businesses, factories in poor countries, and the wealth accumulated or profits from these endeavors do not stay within these poor countries, but rather go to the corporate headquarters in primarily wealthy countries. Um, and this, in many ways, some have drawn the similarities between this and colonialism. Um, and some people refer to this as a form of neocolonialism, where largely Western corporations are able to exploit poor nations for wealth and resources. And the use of multinational corporations the most recent case of this phenomenon. Another major issue is the lack of enforcement in the WTO, where more powerful countries are often able to ignore the rules set by the WTO. While there is and as we discussed, this is kind of similar to what we were discussing with the GATT, right? While there is an arbitration system within the WTO, which is an improvement from the GATT, many powerful states can simply just not obey such rules. A good example is the soft lumber dispute between Canada and the United States. So Canada is one of the largest lumber producers in the world for softwood lumber, and we've been trying to trade with the U.S. without the U.S. putting tariffs on our soft lumber, because the U.S. also has a soft lumber industry which they seek to protect. So they would like Americans to buy American soft lumber and place tariffs on Canadian soft lumber. So Canada has gone to the WTO multiple times now. I think it must be about a dozen, and complains that the Americans are cheating. And the WTO tends to agree with Canada, and tells the United States that they must get rid of these tariffs. And each time the United States says, Thank you. We take seriously your your criticism, but they just ignore this. Um, Similarly, not to just paint Canada with a as an angelic figure here, Canada has also lost at the WTO many times, and does not always adhere to every issue or every policy of the WTO. Famous case is when Bombardier, Canadian company, was trying to sell jets around the world, and the Canadian government was backing the loans to buy these jets when another country wanted to buy jets, right? So this made Bombardier more attractive than other airline companies. I think Brazil was the one that brought Canada to the WTO and complained that Canada was creating an unfair trade regime, right? So Brazil complained, the WTO agreed. However, Canada continued this practice of giving loans to those who wish to buy Canadian jets. So while there is this enforcement mechanism, this mechanism has no teeth. There's no police or ability to sanction countries through the WTO who ignore the rules of international trade. So if you're a rich and powerful enough country, you can simply just ignore many of these rules. One area in particular that countries have been unwilling to lower protections on, Canada included, uh, has been agriculture. Canada, for a very long time, had a wheat board where instead of selling on the international market, uh, farmers would sell to the Canadian government at a set price. Then the Canadian government would sell to the world, giving Canadian farmers a natural advantage in Canada over other farmers around the world. Um, Milk has been a long-standing dispute as well. We'll go into detail next week when we discuss NAFTA. Um, all over the world, countries are very protective of their agricultural industries and do not want to see these industries harmed. And we know in many developing nations and poor nations, the agricultural industry is a major sector in their economy. So seeing this threatened is obviously a major issue for these states. Um, so they create costs through quotas or tariffs to slow down trade to get people to buy local agricultural goods first. Um, so another issue is also for all the growth in trade, we have not seen an equal development of labor rights around the world that go alongside this expansion in trade. If you're going to have open trade, you need to protect workers. And unfortunately, poor workers are exploited all around the world, whether that be through low safety standards, the inability to take sick days, lack of overtime pay, no health benefits, precarious job stability. Um, these are all things that have not been evenly distributed around the world as the expansion of global trade, as global trade is expanded. This has meant that free trade agreements have forced workers to compete in an environment where foreign labor can perhaps be exploited at a much higher rate due to lack of protections within that country for these workers, making the gains of unions and organized labor within certain countries, uh, which were designed as a form of worker security, they can sometimes even be a deficit, creating a reason for production to move to another country or location where workers have less protections in order for these companies to be more competitive and have rising profits. The WTO also does nothing to remedy the wounds of Western colonization. So we know from the history of colonization, many states have had their nations completely ravaged by colonial wars and the wounds of colonization, and have not had proper reparations for these historical crimes and abuses. This has created a condition where poorer and formerly colonized states, which have had their resources stripped and their institutions dismantled in some cases, to effectively start the race of global trade behind the Western colonial powers or the more powerful nation states. forcing them to compete in an unfair race of global capitalism and free trade, right? They're starting from behind the starting line. Similarly, the WTO has not done enough to improve the disparity in infrastructure or internet access around the world, which creates systemic divides and institutional divides in access to trade and global markets, further exacerbating the inequality between poorer and richer nations. So when you create an environment, right, when all the countries operate on the same rules, but not all countries have the same starting point, when we talk about the starting point, the same resources and political histories, et cetera, this makes it difficult to find a lot of space for countries to agree on rules, which make it so the wealthiest countries are able to use such resources to outcompete when the rules are the same across the board for every state, right? It's akin to agreeing to a soccer match between perhaps a well-funded professional soccer team, right? And they're forced to play against a team of amateur players who are perhaps injured, do not have a practice field, and do not have proper equipment, right? So we can see here that even though you could have this soccer match and have all the rules as would be this, for any other soccer match, you can see the unevenness in the teams that are participating in this match, right? The resentment of this inequality has, in global trade, has led to the rise of an anti-globalization movement. We can see this rising from, like I mentioned before, from the right and left of the political spectrum. So those on the right, such as Donald Trump, this has meant a criticism of cultural globalization, perceived as diluting the uniqueness of individual nation states, such as the United States, due to globalization and global trade. Trump criticized free trade relations, targeting countries which are outsourcing labor to foreign countries, sometimes demanding that they bring jobs back to the United States. So this is in response to, of course, many corporations, specifically manufacturing, had moved labor to the global south where they could utilize lower labor costs. You see this with the deterioration of what's sometimes called the Rust Belt in the United States. So for another example be, let's say Nike wanted to make shoes in the United States. But if they move their production, and let's say the minimum wage is $10 in the United States. I forget what it is for each state, but for it's, let's say the minimum wage for a Nike factory in the United States is around $10. If they move production to a much poorer country with a low minimum wage, which is, let's say, $1, that's $9 more profits for the corporation. But it's also a loss of jobs and opportunities in the United States, right? So this has led to a rise in populism in recent years, what's sometimes referred to as populism. We see this in the United States, the United Kingdom, Hungary, Poland, Brazil, as well as many other places. And this is the idea that the individual is kind of getting screwed over by wealthy political and economic elites who write such trade agreements that harm the nation state and its sovereignty and its citizens. Populism is not attributed only to the right, however. There are also anti-globalization populists on the left who criticize the exploitation of global labor, promote solidarity between the workers of the world, and not only solidarity with fellow citizens within the nation state, as a right populist would do. So the left anti-globalization movement is also deeply critical of the environmental damage caused by global trade and global consumerism. Similarly, some on the left are also politically and philosophically opposed to the idea of the nation state and the nation state system as a whole, the concept of borders, etc. So you see that criticism coming as well. There's a famous book by Benjamin Barber, who was written some years ago, called Jihad versus McWorld. And this is discussing that there's a relationship between nationalism and cultural conservatism, and the McWorld, where as things become more and more the same due to globalization, there's also a backlash in response from those who seek to preserve their culture and see the risks of globalization and as a result of globalization become more inward or nationalistic or conservative. And this is dangerous because we're going to be in a McWorld environment. And if the response is more nationalism and cultural conservatism, this will lead to a kind of fragile or even dangerous global political environment, right? So much of the anti-globalization movement and protests are directed against the WTO. Most famous was the 1999 anti-WTO protest in Seattle, sometimes called the Battle of Seattle, probably because it rhymes so nicely. And this was one of the first major protests organized online because it was at the early ages of internet organizing. It caught many security services off guard. And thousands showed up to the protest, angered by the lack of labor and environmental concerns, as well as the imperialist or neocolonial aspects of global trade. Um, so many showed up, and it actually shut down the meeting, the WTO meeting. So the Battle of Seattle in 1999 very much brought the issues of globalization to the forefront and really raised consciousness about these issues for many at the time. For the right of the political spectrum, a major moment for the right-wing anti-globalization movement was the election of Donald Trump to the US presidency. His America First strategy promoted the interests of national industry and global trade. As a protectionist, Trump promoted the use of tariffs and criticized or dissolved free trade agreements. Many of these policies have actually been continued by the Biden administration, interestingly, specifically the protectionism around certain goods. So Biden similarly sees an interest in protecting the interests of national workers and industry over those interests of those outside the United States, because after all, he's elected by those within his nation state and not by citizens of the world, right? We see this globally, where many powerful states increasingly reject aspects or rules of globalization whenever it negatively impacts their nation state. We see this in the big case with Brexit as well, where the UK left the European Union in order to have more national sovereignty over trade and other issues, namely immigration, refugees, etc. This choice of exit from transnational or global institutions due to rising populism has also led to a variety of unintended consequences for some of these states as well, as we've seen in the United Kingdom in recent years, and we'll discuss more in a couple of weeks. The anti-globalization movement, we see a concern over sovereignty, right? The word we've used in previous weeks. The power of transnational corporations are seen as growing much faster than the power of nation states and the strength of their institutions. The inability to protect data and privacy is also a major issue for the anti-globalization movement. Environmental damage is also a major issue of globalized trade, and one which is increasingly felt by individuals around the world, but primarily felt by the global poor, who live in precarious conditions or are directly dependent on the environment for their sustenance day to day. So there's some things that we should think about, and I'm sure that this will seep into your accountability assignment for this week, which I have placed on Blackboard. How can the WTO be better at its enforcement of its rules? So we can think of some ways in which the WTO could improve. Um, how can we get the benefits of global trade without the negatives? Is this possible? Is there a way that we can maximize the positive aspects of global trade while mitigating the consequences or the unintended consequences of this? Um, and maybe what is the biggest issue that has resulted from globalization for in your mind? What is the primary downsides to globalization? We've talked about some of them today. I'd be interested for you to think about what are the negative consequences of globalization. Onto your accountability assignment. Okay, so reminder, the accountability assignment is in your weekly package on Blackboard. It's in the same package that you're watching this video in. You must submit by Friday at 6 p.m. Barrie time. If you are anticipating technical difficulties, or if you think that that's a possibility, I'd recommend getting it done much earlier so you can make sure you submit before 6 p.m. and not leaving it until the last 30 seconds to submit and then say, oh, my internet went down, etc., because I will not be accepting assignments past 6 p.m. Barrie time. So you should have more than enough time to do this assignment. It's only, I think, 300 words. So make sure that it's finished before 6 p.m. Barrie time if you anticipate that there's any issue. If you do not send on Turnitin with your accountability statement, you will not receive a grade. So make sure you have the accountability statement pasted onto your assignment. Remember to follow the instructions carefully. This includes alphabetizing references and making sure you answer the questions asked and not just going off on a tangent that doesn't answer the question that I'm discussing that's mentioned in the assignment. It must follow APA format, and that includes alphabetizing your sources and making sure that everything is done to APA format, including your title page. You make sure you have a title page. Make sure you read over your assignment for grammatical errors. There's been some issues with grammar for many of you. So if you read a sentence in your assignment when you're reading it over, and this doesn't sound like a sentence that you would read in a newspaper, magazine, or book, it's likely that it's incorrectly written and it's not grammatically sound. So make sure you're reading over your assignments and making sure that the content is strong and not just kind of fluffy statements saying, the most powerful countries are the most powerful because they have the most power in the global environment. Stuff that doesn't. I've had a few assignments now that have had sentences like that just don't really add any analysis or do not show a lot of knowledge of course materials. So just make sure that you're conscious of these sentences that do not add anything to your analysis, because they might as well be eliminated if they do not show me that you've engaged with the course material in any way. So make sure you do not lose track of the question within your answer. In your honesty statement, you can just type your name. You do not need to sign or anything. You just make sure that your name's typed in the honesty statement and it's pasted to the assignment. Other than that, I think that, and make sure your honesty statement, I should say, will affect your Turnitin report, but that's fine. I take that into account. So obviously, when you're submitting, if your Turnitin report shows that you have similarity due to you attaching your honesty statement, do not worry about that. I take that into account. But I think that's all I have for you this week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. I look forward to reading your assignments, and thank you all for listening. Take care.